Hi and welcome to this first lecture on sources of data collection and analysis. Since unfortunately we do not have an opportunity to continue discussing your part of your proposals, or at least for some of you, and we have to delay that until we return at the beginning of April, we can now move to the sources of data collection and analysis. As I said, when we speak about research methods or research designs, we have to identify whether we are going to design our research to be focused more on quantitative or qualitative methods, and also to clarify what sources of data collection will we depend on. Interviewing is one of these sources, but also we can depend on observation as another qualitative method. And for data analysis, we can depend on content analysis, which we will discuss later. So for this and the next lecture, we'll be focusing on interviews, and especially elite interviews, because we have two different types of interviews, as we will see: interviews for political elites and interviews for ordinary people. And to discuss interviews, we will start by defining what do we mean by interviews, how interviews are conducted, the different ways in which interviews can be conducted, and then at what stage are interviews conducted. Shall we conduct interviews at the beginning of our research, or after reviewing our literature, secondary literature, or at the end of our research project? Or can we actually do interviews in all these stages? The third question is, how can we select the sample of interviewees? Is it just that I go and select any group of people, right? If I'm meeting ordinary people, or meet, any government official if I'm interested in knowing the views of elites? Or are there rules, specific rules to follow in selecting the interviewees? Then we have also to look at how can we increase the validity and reliability of interviews. We have many problems in the interviews and challenges that we will discuss. What if the person is contradicting himself or inconsistent, or the person that I'm interviewing is trying to hide information? How can I manage all these challenges and try to increase the credibility of the results that I will get from interviews? And then part of this is also how to design interview questions, starting from how many questions should I have or should I ask the person, to what order of questions, and how can I design each question. And then after actually conducting the interview, which also has its own rules, of course, to increase its credibility, as we will see, we will have, maybe tens of pages of insights and views and information provided by different interviewees. And the question here is what to do with all this material. How can we analyze the interviews and use them in writing our research? And then finally, we will mention a few also ethical questions in using the data that was provided in interviews. So to start with, how to define interviews, and why is it important to conduct interviews in social sciences in general and political science in particular? I think it's obvious that, interviews as used even in journalism or in research as a method for data collection is simply asking individuals a series or a number of questions and recording the responses, right? And there are different ways in which we can do that. We can do that face to face, which is the best of course way, because as we will see later, I'm not only interested in the information and views that are provided by the person or the respondent, or we can call him the interviewee, but I'm also interested in his expressions, in his body language, and this will only be clear if I'm doing face-to-face interview. But we can also do that if, of course, with the technology which we are even using now in this presentation, and with even more advanced way of technology, We can use modern technologies like, Skype or other software programs, Zoom, or we can even use more primitive sort of communication like telephone or by email. But of course, all of these will have the advantage and disadvantage. Maybe Skype will be a very good, or Zoom or any other audio and video means will have, similar advantage as the face-to-face interviews, because at the end of the day you can see the expressions and, as I said, the body language of the interviewee. But this will be, of course, lacked in the case of phone interviews or email interviews. And of course, again, I mean, in email interviews you also have the disadvantage of having less and less respondents, right? So you have what we call a high rate of non-response, because you cannot expect people simply to spend hours in answering your question in writing. So you most probably will get less response rate if you're conducting people by email than if you're contacting them and say, well, I'll come to your office or to wherever place convenient to you to meet you, right? Interviews can also be structured, i.e. all the questions are predetermined in advance. There is no room for adding any other questions. But these are rarely used in our research, because we have either semi-structured, which is actually the favorite sort of interviews. And here in the semi-structured interviews you have a first set of questions, say 5, 7, 8 questions, but then you have the ability to add questions, what we call follow-up questions, i.e. you can add questions to clarify some of the responses of the interviewee, or to add something or add a question that was not in your mind in the first place based on his responses, and so on. And there are other more challenging interviews, which are unstructured interviews. So you simply go, and these are used more in what we call ethnographic studies, that actually talk to people, not to elites. You cannot go to elites and start a conversation without any questions. You have to have a few questions in mind, and then you add, as we said, questions based on the responses. But when you speak with ordinary people in ethnographic studies, that simply is based on reflecting people's views and opinions and ways of life and life stories and so on and so forth. Here you can simply have one general question, and then you leave the person to answer this question maybe in an hour or two, right? So this is totally unstructured. I'm simply interested in the different ways in which this ordinary person will define a certain concept like democracy or development or what have you, and I totally leave the space to him to answer, right? But in most of our interviews, again, especially elite interviews, we use semi-structured interviews. Interviews may also differ, right? As we said in the beginning, they may be with elites or maybe with ordinary individuals, so they may differ according to the targeted interviews. Now, what is the importance of interviews? Why should we depend on interviews in the first place? Why not simply go and select some secondary sources, i.e. read books and articles and so on and so forth, and collect the data we need? As Richard said, and this is just one of the basic strengths of interviews, the basic function, especially of elite interviews, is to provide what we call, a journey into the mindset of the basic actors, the influential actors who played an important role in taking specific decisions or shaping society, influence society in a particular way. And I think the word mindset and views and so on is very important here, because we are not, in interviews, we are not only interested in facts. Of course, yes, we are interested in knowing, for instance, how a decision was taken, right? What were the different stages, who were the person that were involved, and so on and so forth. but we're also interested in the views on how these persons who were very influential, right, holding formal or informal positions of power, by the way, how they actually view, you know, specific events or specific decisions or what have you. So we're collecting actually both facts and views. You may also ask the question, but why simply do not distribute surveys instead of just sitting with the person and talking to him for half an hour or an hour or so? Why just I don't put these questions in a survey and give the survey to him to answer? Of course, as we mentioned before, there are many advantages for having interviews, especially face-to-face interviews. First of all, we have the opportunity to clarify questions or clarify the responses of the respondent or the interviewee, right? And see his, as I just mentioned, see his views on certain concepts and certain variables, and also explore even unexpected responses. And this is one of the advantages that, well, with discussion and with the interviewee opening up and feeling, easy to reveal maybe classified information, but also very sincere and open views, you may get unexpected responses, right? And with dialogue with the interviewee, as we will see later, you have the opportunity to dig deep into his mind and discover more and more information. It also allow, and again, this is one of the advantages of face-to-face interviews, allow the interviewer or the researcher in this case to evaluate the respondent's attitudes. Not only how what he knows, but how he feels. Does he feel very strong about certain situation? Is he very much for or very much against a certain concept or variables, things again like cooperation between specific countries, as I will say later in my own experience interviewing different officials in Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia a couple of years ago on a project on cooperation in the Nile. Do these officials feel very strong for or against a specific project or specific positions of other countries? All these can actually be more and more explored in interviews rather than just surveys. And as I said, one of the advantages of interviews is that, well, you're looking for also information that are missing in secondary literature, right? So you're interviewing people who, as we said, took part in specific decisions and specific projects, in designing specific, government policies, and you want to ask them why this happened or did not happen, right? So for instance, again, I'll be using frequently my own research because that's what I know more about. So as I told you, a couple of years ago I was conducting a research project on economic cooperation between the three Eastern Nile countries, Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan, right? And it was evident that there is much opportunity for, many opportunities for cooperation, and that many projects were actually proposed between Egypt and Ethiopia, between Sudan and Egypt, for economic cooperation in different fields, right? In agriculture, in hydropower, and so on and so forth. No other study actually, or secondary literature, was presented to justify or to explain why specific projects were not moving, right? So one of my questions to different officials in the three countries, as you will see later when we see the interview protocol and list of questions, was mentioning specific examples, specific projects, and asking why this was not implemented, although it was proposed many years ago. What progress has been made, why it was this or that project or policy or initiative or what have you was not implemented, right? So here I'm getting information that I cannot get elsewhere. And that's why it's very important, as we'll see later, to start by reading what is already known, so that you can, when you ask questions about what you do not know, right? But also an indirect advantage of interview, which is very important for a researcher. So for those of you who plan to be researchers in the future, because I know many of you have different plans about working or not working on research. So if you plan to work in the field of research, you should have, a network of people who are working on the topic that you're interested in. So if you're interested in social policies, for instance, in education or health or what have you, you should actually try to get access to people working on these issues, right? Members of parliament, politicians, bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways to get access to these people and develop your networks is actually through conducting interviews with these people, right? Meeting them first, as we'll see in different situations, in a conference, in a workshop, what have you, and then trying to hold face-to-face interviews with them and sustain this relationship in the future. This does not mean, of course, that, well, there are no challenges associated with conducting interviews. As I mentioned before, you may not be able to access, specific people. Maybe because they are too senior. If we're speaking about elite interviews, they're holding, senior positions, so they're very busy. They cannot see you, or even ordinary people, maybe very, conservative, right, in speaking to researchers and so on and so forth, especially in, closed societies and context like ours, for instance. And of course, some of these challenges can be overcome, right? We'll be speaking later about how to get access to people and to elites and so on and so forth. But whatever degree of success you achieve in meeting people, elites or otherwise, you have to acknowledge that in your research. So to start in reporting the results by saying, well, I was planning to meet X and Y and Z, and I managed to meet X, but I did not manage to meet Y and Z. Or that, well, I was planning to meet, I don't know, 600 persons, but I only met, I don't know, half of this number, right? Of course, if you're doing elite interviews, 600 is of course, a very big number anyway, but in any case, if you're doing, as we said, ethnographic study, i.e. if you're meeting people, you will most probably need to meet much less than this number. But in any case, you have to reveal all this, right? So you have to acknowledge the fact that you succeeded in meeting some people but not others. The second big challenge is the reliability of the interviewee may be actually questionable or problematic. So if you're meeting an official, for instance, who's very old, but he took decisions, 20, 30 years ago, he may have, some sort of inaccuracy in the information. He may not remember some of these information. And of course, the only way in which you can actually try to, avoid this problem is to triangulate sources. What do we mean by triangulation of sources? The diversification of sources, to simply put it, right? So you're not going to, of course, speak only with this person, right? So you're going to speak with other persons who also took, who took part in this decision. So you will know whether he's accurate or not, or whether he is actually trying to hide specific information. So as we will see later, when analyzing the results of the interviews, you're gonna actually compare all these information and views and facts that you get from different interviews. But you will also combine these interviews with other sources, like if you have, for instance, autobiography or biography of a certain person. Of course, the autobiography is a source written by the person himself, and biography is a life story written by another person about this person. Um, so you have this as another sort of primary information or secondary information in such a case. Um, or other secondary sources as well, right? So you have to diversify your sources and diversify even your interviewees. You may have, as I said, inconsistencies, i.e. contradictions in the responses of the same same interviewee, or in different interviews. And the only way that you can deal with that is to flag or to highlight these contradictions. So you are not, supposed to, intervene by saying, well, X was right and Y was wrong, but simply to say that there are two narratives or two stories about this, you know, uh, case, or about this decision, or about this historical incidents, or what have you, whatever thing you're researching, right? So there are a person who was saying that, it was only a single person who took these decisions, and another person who said, for instance, that there were many parties involved. So you simply try to highlight the different points of view, and if you have a certain explanation or of why this is the case, you can also offer it. A third challenge is that, and it's also a common challenge, is that the interviewee may try to control the interview. So obviously you cannot, I mean, it's very common for interviewees, especially those who are holding senior positions, senior political positions, to be very conservative. They do not know you in the first place, so there is no reason for them to be open and frank and so on and tell everything. Yeah. So you should actually expect that to happen, right? And part of the success of the interview will depend on your skills, your talent, right, in managing the interview and the flow of discussions, but also on your knowledge of the topic, the effort that you made, and we'll come to this point later, the effort that you made preparing for each interview and preparing for your project as a whole. So you can give the impression to the interviewee, especially if we're speaking about elite interviews, to give him the impression that you know well about your topic, that you are in command with your topic, and that you know what you're asking about. Or you can actually give him the impression that you know very little, and thus he will actually not take you seriously and will actually control the interview totally, and just tell you what he wants to say. The last challenge is also a common challenge, especially in more so in closed systems, but it can also be found in other contexts, which is the issue of security or cultural sensitivity, right? So in some, of course, countries, senior officials or officials in general, or even bureaucrats, are not that open to research circles, so they do not have any belief that, well, what researchers are doing is important. They do not have any faith in research and knowledge and so on and so forth. Or they may be, as I said, very conservative, consider a specific issue as highly sensitive, so they may be a bit closed in revealing, their views or information and so on. And you should also be careful when you are researching these specific sensitive topics. Like when you are working on minorities, for instance, right, and the rights of minorities. So you should be very careful, because minorities are often vulnerable and weak, and they are very, conservative towards strangers. So especially if you come from another country or from the majority, this will be problematic. Or you're asking for questions. So for instance, we have a colleague who is working on gender relations in Egypt, and she conducted interviews with ordinary people in different places in Egypt, and different governorates in Alexandria and other places. And of course, you can see, I mean, there is a level of difference, of course, if you're holding interviews with people in a certain level of education and class or what have you. They may be more open or maybe less open. It depends. Especially if you're actually researching a sensitive issue like gender and family relations and relations between men and women in the same family and so on and so forth. So you can expect these issues to be very sensitive. As we'll see later, part of dealing with that is to simply be very careful in designing your questions and when to ask these questions. But you should expect this to be, a bit problematic in terms of research. And this does not mean that we should not work on these issues, but we should be aware of these difficulties in the first place and try to, get around them one way or the other. The second point is the question of when do I conduct my interviews, right? So now I'm working on a research project and I discovered that it will be interesting and there will be an added value of holding interviews either with ordinary people and or with elites. And of course, it's totally the nature of the research topic and the research question that will determine what research, what sources of information, what sources of data you will depend on, or what sources of data will be useful, right? So if your topic is, it's convenient and it's useful for your topic to hold interviews, the next question then is when do I conduct these interviews? Most interviews are conducted in later stages in the research project after reviewing literature, after reviewing secondary data. And this is important for many reasons, right? You have, as I said before, you have to know what we already know about the topic so that you identify what are the gaps and thus ask questions that address these gaps in our knowledge, right? And of course, this means that you will then add to our understanding of a specific issue because you're making a contribution. You're conducting interviews to collect primary data yourself, and this will be a big contribution in itself, right? Of course, this is also important because this will show to the interviewee, especially in elite interviews, that you know about the topic, right? So this will actually, as we said before, give a very positive impression to the interviewee about you. But one has to say that you can also, in topics that are relatively new, that have not been researched before, you can do interviews in the very early stages to explore the nature of the topic. So for instance, I knew recently that one of our colleagues is working on social norms, right? Social practices and why some organizations, institutions, including things like, sporting clubs or sporting unions in Egypt and so on, are more effective than others. And simply this is, for a political science, this is a new topic, right? And there's no such literature that addressed this. So for him it was important to go and hold interviews with these institutions, with these effective institutions, and try to ask the questions why, right? So we always go and consult secondary sources to know what explanations have been offered to our research question. But if there was no explanation, provided before, so we need to know that, we need to collect data in the first place in order to, explore the nature of a topic that is totally new. You can also hold what we call follow-up interviews, i.e. I conducted an interview with a government official and he was nice enough to say, well, if you need any information or clarification in the future, you can contact me again. And while analyzing, the results of his interview, I found that I need some clarification, so I go and see him again and clarify all these issues. This can also happen, right? But of course, this does not mean that you should always count on meeting people a couple of times, because when we speak about elite interviews, those, as I said at the beginning, right, those are very busy people who will only give you, maybe a few minutes even, or if you're lucky, half an hour or an hour. So do not count on, meeting him again. But if he's cooperative enough to offer you that you can meet him again, so this means that you can do that as a follow-up interview. Now, how to select the sample of interviewees, right? Of course, you can say, well, this depends on the nature of the topic, which is correct, but also it depends on why you're conducting the interviews in the first place. Do you aim at generalization? So you're interested, for instance, in knowing the views of members of the Egyptian parliament on the Egyptian-Ethiopian conflict or tension over the Renaissance dam, for instance, right? So I need here a level of generalization, right? My objective is to end up by saying that most of the members of Egyptian parliament see that, well, it can only be resolved, for instance, these tensions can only be resolved through peaceful means, or that we can use more, we can propose economic incentives to Ethiopia, or what have you, whatever statements I'm going to make. My objective is generalization, right? Or that I'm interested in, knowing the views of employees in a certain institution on the level of their satisfaction, for instance, in working in this institution, right? So here I'm not interested in a specific person who holds a specific position. I'm interested in making general statements. And as we said before, of course, and this is again pure statistics, to end up with generalization, you have to select random samples. And again, we are not going to go into the details of that because, again, you can go to your Introduction to Statistics course and know the different types of random samples. But we have, for instance, things like simple random samples or stratified random samples. In stratified samples, I want actually to capture the views of, yes, different members of parliament, different employees, but from different ages, right? So I, stratify or divide, the members of parliament or employees or what have you into different groups according to their age, right? And then randomly select from each group, right? Or the same if I'm interested in comparing the views according to the different, political parties, the views of different political parties. So to avoid the fact, if I, draw a simple random sample, I may find in the sample more members of a certain political party. So what I should do then is to divide the members of parliament into different political parties according to their political affiliation, and then I select randomly from each group, right? So it's still a random sample, still I can make generalizations, but here I can also compare different age groups or political parties or what have you, right? But still, these are all random samples for generalization. In elite interviews, we're often interested in what we call purposive sample, and these, of course, are not random samples, right? We're not interested in generalization. I'm interested to know the position of this influential government official, right? Who holds who is responsible for the file of, cooperation between Egypt and Ethiopia in the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation or what have you. So I cannot simply go and randomly select from the ministry, right? I have to go and speak to the person who is in charge of this file, the vice, minister for African Affairs or for Nile Waters or what have you, right? So that's what we call a purposive sample, right? عينة عمدية. So why? Because I'm deliberately selecting specific people who, are responsible for a specific area, region, what have you, or who took place in certain decisions. A third type of sample, but this is actually weaker type of sample, is what we call convenience sample. And as it's clear from its name, and I think this is, that this is also a type of non-random samples. Convenience sample is simply those people whom I can get access to, right? So it's simply the people that I was able to reach, as simple as that, right? And of course, yes, I mean, this is, we can say, better than nothing, but at the end of the day, we cannot generalize, right? The fourth type of sample is what we call snowball sample, and the snowball again is a famous type of non-random samples, and it's based on the idea that one person will lead to the other. So as we will see later, when you hold the interview, at the end of each interview, you should actually ask your interviewee whether he can recommend another person, right? And a person will lead to another person, and a person will lead to another person, and that's why we call it snowball, right? And of course, again, here you cannot generalize because it's a non-random sample. And also it cannot be used alone. So you cannot simply say, well, I will start with a single person that I know and then he will lead me to others. No, of course not, right? You start with the purposive sample, right? These are the persons who are holding the influential positions on the topic that I'm interested in. Say 20 persons. And then to that, we add the snowball sample. We add the people that were recommended by these 20 people. Right? So if you again increase the credibility and the reliability, because the more people you speak to, the more you will be able to compare results and get a more credible story about what you're looking for. The last point for today, and we're going to discuss the rest of the issues later. But the last point for today is how to design interview questions. So now I recognize that there will be a value added in conducting interviews. I decided on what persons I need to meet, which persons, right? As I said, define my sample, my list of people that I will target. The next question would then be how to design good interview questions. First, on the number of questions. Of course, you should be careful here because, especially as I said, especially if you're doing an elite interview that will not last more than 1 hour, you have to be careful not to be too ambitious, right? So you have something like from 5 to 10 questions, not more than that, because you have to leave a space for the follow-up questions. Remember we said, well, the best type of interview is what we call the semi-structured interview, which means that you can add follow-up questions, right? So most probably you will not even have time to ask all these questions, which will relate to the question of order that we will discuss later, right? But you should put number of questions that is not too long, not too ambitious, right? And as we said, I mean, of course, you will allow for the follow-up questions in a semi-structured format. But in terms of how to write questions, it's important to keep them actually, and this is, I think, a common point in both survey questions and interview questions, right? That you have to have a neutral language, right? A non-judgmental language, right? Just to give you an example, if you want to ask the person about his view on the relationship between two countries, between, say, to stick to the same example, Egypt and Ethiopia, right? So instead of asking him, what do you think about the very bad, tense, conflictive or conflictual relationship between the two countries, you should ask, how do you evaluate the relationship between the two countries? What is the difference between the two questions? Obviously, the first question is very judgmental. You're giving actually a clue to the interview. You're telling him that you already, define the relations to be conflictual, to be tense, to be bad, what have you, right? And thus you're actually, either this will provoke the interview to say no, it's not that bad as you're saying, or actually to in order to be affirmative and give you something that is an easy answer, he will say yes, it's tense, and so on and so forth. So try to be neutral in selecting the words for your question. The fourth general rule in designing the questions for interviews, and especially in elite interviews, and especially with senior and known and noted figures and elite figures, you do not ask him about his or her background, especially if they are too senior, as we said, right? So if you're meeting, a vice minister, for instance, most probably you will find a lot about his profile in the website of the ministry or in other sources. So you should actually do your homework, and before going and meeting this guy, you simply Google his name and see what his work experience, where he served before, for how long did he serve in that country, and thus try to design your questions on the one hand to get new information, and on the other hand appear that you actually know about the person. It makes a big difference. Try also not to ask very general questions that can be answered from other sources. Yes, you can ask general questions, as you will see in the list that we will discuss later, but do not ask questions that you will find from other sources. Like if you're doing an interview with a party leader, for instance, do not go and ask him about the structure of the party, because you can get that from the library of the party or any other source, right? So do not waste his time in things that are very descriptive, right? If you want to ask, again, a government official about why a certain agreement was not applied, do not ask him what the agreement is saying in this article. Of course, you should read the agreement if it is published, and if it is declared. Of course, if it is not published, this is something else. If it is somehow a secret agreement, the details of which are not, disclosed, so you can then ask him, like the situation that we have now. For instance, we know that the declaration of principles signed between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan in 2015 is declared. We know the details, but we do not know the details of the American plan or proposed plan that was proposed to the three parties last month in order to sign. Right? So we can ask government officials from the three countries, if we're meeting them, about the details of this plan and why they liked or did not like it. Right? But you cannot ask them about things that you will find elsewhere. You can also, which is useful, in each question, as we will see in a minute, you can give a brief introduction in the question that shows that you know about the topic, but try to keep it brief, because you should not actually give the interviewee the impression that you know more than him, because then he will not be eager to tell you what you need to know, what you should know. So to be very practical, let me end here by proposing a model of what we call an interview protocol and questions. So the interview protocol is simply the few pages that you will send to the target interviewee, to the elite, to the government official. Of course, ordinary people, it's a different story, because you do not, write official letters to normal people to ask them for interviews. You simply try to reach them through their relatives, or someone from the community, or what have you. But for government officials, you have to write official letters to them. It will even be better if it is not you who actually write the letter, but your institution, right? So in my case, for instance, when I was conducting these interviews in the 3 countries, in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, a couple of years ago, I asked the faculty to write the letters for Egyptian officials. And then I was hosted by 2 research centers in Ethiopia and Sudan, and it was also these research centers that actually addressed the government officials in the 2 countries in order to arrange for the interviews. So it makes it, and this is one of the clues of getting access to people, getting access to important people, right? So to be very, very practical, this is the model of the interview protocol, which should include a brief introduction about yourself and your project and so on, and why you need to do this interview, and then the questions, right? So that's what we call interview protocol, right? And if you're doing a thesis, if you're doing a master's or a PhD, you can attach this protocol to the thesis at the end. If you're publishing an article, you can just mention the basic, as we will see, the basic, question that you ask all the people that you met, but not necessarily, list all the protocol. Anyway, in the interview protocol, as I said, you need to address the person in the most official and formal way. We'll be speaking about that later, but as you can see, you say that the person X, which is your name, which is affiliated with this institution holding this position, is conducting a research project on blah blah blah, right? The topic of your research, and the project explores blah blah blah. So you give a brief introduction, just 1 sentence or 2 sentences, because again, if you're speaking about elites, they will not actually spend time reading 2-3 pages on your proposal. They are not interested in that. They just want to have a background information about what you're doing, right? And that this person, this researcher, he or she plans to hold interviews with whatever, government officials, bureaucrats, political party leaders, whatever. And then you say that, well, given your official position as, I don't know, a party leader or a prime minister or what have you, or given your expertise, because elite interviewing also include not only government elites but also intellectuals and scholars. So myself, I receive requests for interviews from different less senior scholars, those doing masters or PhD in different European or American universities, who know that, well, I'm working on issues related to Nile politics, so I receive frequently these interview requests, for instance. So they say, well, given your position or your expertise and knowledge in the topic, we will appreciate as an institution that you meet our researcher for an interview that will last for this period. So I have to mention that, well, this will continue for 30 or 45 minutes, and also make sure to tell him or her, the interviewee, that the information provided in the interview will remain confidential, right? If he wants it to be so, i.e. it will only be used for research purposes. His name will not be mentioned. As we will see later, we can see that a government official said so and so, but if he made a condition that he should remain anonymous, i.e. his name is not mentioned, so I should respect that, and this is one of the ethical issues that we will come to later. And then I write my contacts, simply email and telephone number. So these are the first couple of paragraphs that have to be included in the interview protocol. And then we move to the questions. Right, so in the questions here, and again this is the project that I conducted in cooperation between the 3 Eastern countries, I will not read all the questions, but just give you hints on what I was talking about in terms of, what are the general rules in designing the questions. So again, since I am interested in the person's view because he's an influential official holding an important position, so I'm interested in knowing his views in addition to the facts, right? So there should be questions that deal with these views, right? So as you can see in the first question, for instance, I'm asking state officials, and these were the questions directed to state officials because I had other interviewees included from the private sector and so on and so forth. So if you have different groups, you should actually design different questions according to what you're interested in knowing from these different groups. So I'm asking them about actually state officials about their views. How do you perceive so and so, as in the first question? How do you view cooperation between the 3 countries, right? But I can then also be more specific and say, for instance, and here again, just to show the interviewee, this government official, that I know I have a background information about their policy or their vision or what have you. So in the case of Ethiopia, for instance, I know that there is or there was a foreign policy plan or strategy or what have you that was designed back in 2002. So I asked him, does this vision still guide your policy? Right? So this is more specific. Or in the case of Egypt and Sudan, do you actually support the Ethiopian position that, well, we can have a cooperation based on the comparative advantage? Again, we're not interested in all these details, but we're interested in the general rules that are followed in designing these questions, right? And then we can ask, of course, practical questions. Again, question whose answer cannot be found elsewhere. So I ask him, for instance, how does your ministry or department coordinate with other state ministries? You cannot find this information elsewhere. And again, the same point here. Is your institution involved in bilateral or trilateral cooperation with other Eastern countries, and in what areas? And then I ask him about the connection between, cooperation on the Nile and cooperation in other areas, which was my basic research question. But then I am trying to make more specific questions related to specific projects, and again these on the one hand show my knowledge about the topic, that I know that these initiatives were proposed, and on the other hand I'm collecting information, as I said, that cannot be found elsewhere. So for instance, I'm saying that, Egypt proposed in February 2016 an initiative for establishing a development fund, right? So why this fund was not established? What is your position? What progress has been made? All these information are new. I cannot find them elsewhere. And at the same time, it's important to know the position of Sudan and Ethiopia from these initiatives that are proposed by Egypt, right? The same in the other project on the Mediterranean Victoria navigational line. Again, the details of these projects are not important here. I'm just interested in telling you how we can design more specific information, right, and know from these questions, or from answering these questions, important details that cannot be found in other sources. And then I can have finally something about future visions. What visions do you have for future cooperation between the 3 countries? So I think you now have got a good idea about, why do we need to conduct interviews in social research in general, political research in particular. How do we select the sample of interviewees, and how do we design the research questions, which are very different, by the way, from the research questions of our proposal or our project. So obviously all these questions that are listed here as interview questions are not the same as my research questions, but they are actually somehow a kind of a translation of my research questions into more specific questions that deal, as I said, with information that are missing in the literature or views that I'm interested to know from these persons given their influential positions. Next time we'll be speaking about, again, what to do while conducting the interview itself. Now I managed to get access, we'll see also that, how to get access to people, right? So now I managed to get access to the important people that I want to meet. How can I actually prepare myself to the interview, how I can manage this interview to get better results, and of course finally how I can analyze the results of these interviews. I think before moving to this second part, it will be useful for you to read the recommended article. And again, I mean, because you will not be, or not all of you will be allowed to, or will have time, of course, to conduct interviews during this semester. I mean, in normal circumstances, I often ask students to go and conduct one interview with even a university professor just to practice what we're saying here. But since we do not have time to do that, and even as an assignment, some of you may see that they will not depend on interviews, so they will not be required actually. So if they're doing a survey, I will ask them in the final proposal to design a survey, not an interview protocol. So since you will not have the same opportunity to practice what we're saying, so it will be useful for you to read a resource that depended on this source of data or information. So here I'm recommending my article, which was published last year on the same topic that I've been mentioning a lot in this lecture, which is elite perceptions and cooperation in the Eastern Nile. It's not important for you to read the whole article, but at least make sure to read the introductory and methodological section, because this is what we're interested in. And then you can, skim through the rest of the article just to know how I analyze the results and so on and so forth, and maybe just read the conclusion, right? But it's just important to look at the methodological section to know how researchers, including myself, actually apply this tool. So next time we'll continue with interviews, and hopefully by then you will have read the article, and also after reading and listening to this lecture and to the other lecture, if you have any questions, you can either email me or send me also an email via Moodle. And if you feel that you need more, or you're interested in practicing this method, and you have issues or difficulties and so on, we can even meet on Skype or Zoom or any other convenient method. Thank you, and stay tuned for the rest of this series of lectures on methods of data collection.